I would call upon NB Ullekh, author and journalist. 15 മിനിറ്റാണ്. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished people on the dais, um, I want to start with the premise that the role of media in democracy, one of the key roles of the media in democracy is to speak truth to power. In this talk, I wish to focus mainly on the mainstream media, not the independent media. A lot of people here are going to speak about it, and I think a lot of people have already spoken about the role of the independent media. But I'm going to focus on the changes that have happened in mainstream media over the past several years, and I wouldn't hesitate to call it a change since Modi coming back to power or coming to power in at the center. Um, and we see a lot of failure on the part of the mainstream media to even crack a joke, forget even speaking truth to the powers that be. So this is happening, especially this is happening in India since the rise of Modi to what looks like the pinnacle of his political career. It's not space science or topology, but absolute common sense that journalism changes dramatically and vacates his rightful role under authoritarian rule, wherever it is, be it in India or anywhere else. We saw it happen in India during emergency, and some of us have not seen it directly, but we have read and heard about the excesses of emergency. Now, we have in power an authoritarian regime that demonstrates fascist tendencies, especially when it comes to muscling the media, primarily when it comes to muscling the press and in going after anyone who it seems as inconvenient, be it a writer or a public intellectual, a professor, or a journalist. The more inconvenient a journalist or an academic professor or a public intellectual become, the worse the plight. They're immediately sidelined in their profession or in their organizations, especially if it's an organization that has decided to sell its soul to the powers that be. They can land in these journalists or public intellectuals. They can even land in jail, and or they can be harassed or demonized by social media trolls and IT cell heads. If they are associated with an organization that defies the government, the organization itself invites the wrath of very powerful people who have, as we know, apparently destroyed institutions and meticulously misuse agencies that literally parrot the government line, however whimsical they turn out to be. And what follows invariably, and we have seen it happening right in front of our eyes, is legal and digital repression, and in some cases, witch hunt of the scale we have only heard before India became free. This is not a phenomenon associated with democracy. This is a phenomenon associated with monarchy. And we live in a democracy. We are supposed to be part of a democracy. And it's in a monarchy where anyone who questions the king or the emperor or any figure who resembles that kind of nomenclature um, uh, is branded or abused as a traitor, anti national, and the sort. So, what we see here in India is an outcome, and it's you can characterize it as a legitimized and weaponized toxic mix of Islamophobia, Dalitphobia, and leftphobia. If you are in pursuit of journalism that we learned in journalism schools, you are immediately discredited, and the organization that shares your values and stands by you instantly stigmatized. Let me now come to the tangible changes that we have seen happening in mainstream media since the crowning of Narendra Modi. Prior to 2004, there used to be this joke in Delhi. Um, that the political bureaus of a few top newspapers in the country were being run by a certain lawyer politician, and he was called the bureau chief. That was part joke, that was partly true as well, but things were much better because editors back then had a spine. With Modi consolidating his power, especially after he got re-elected in 2019, this idea of a super bureau chief, an extra constitutional authority by all means that presides over the running of news organizations, either in print or TV, has unfortunately become a naked reality. As a result, there has been a phenomenal overhaul of how news organizations function. Let me explain. The first casualty are editors at the top echelons of a news organization who typically used to enjoy a certain political autonomy by virtue of keeping a cautious distance from politicians as regards daily news flow was concerned is gone. Uh, and what happens now then? Editors literally act like public affairs personnel for the government, which dictates to them what is the story of the day, what are the stories of the day. The second tragedy is the death of the reporter as a job function and an institution. I'm not talking about people like Vicheda Singh. I'm talking in general about what's happening in mainstream media with editors working as public relations officer for the government and the reporter stands virtually cancelled or obliterated. This is a big departure from how journalism used to be practiced before in India, except during the dark days and nights of emergency. I'm not talking about independent media outlets like The Wire or Caravan, where the reporter performs what he or she is meant to do, gathering news. For the new editor of the New India, which are mostly government affiliated or government monitored mainstream media, news isn't what his or her reporters bring to the table, but the news of the day, the grandees in New Latins Delhi of the Central Vista make want him to carry in exchange for what he thinks as the holy grail of journalism, access access to ministers and ministries. And let me explain that. The news story that is released the most, as John Bittas had already pointed out in the news media of New India, is interviews with the ministers in the union government. You may laugh, but believe me, this is a new idea, new metaphor for a scoop. Often, these interviews are not one-on-one interactions, but written responses to questions that are meant to please the masters, not actually to probe them. The quid pro quo is proof of a certain stability in the newsroom, and these interviews are hardly hard talk, but a nibble of sorts in the ear. But such capitulation, such surrender of journalistic values is good news for our esteemed media groups, for they are allowed to function without income tax rates or ED summons or such inconvenience. So now, let's see what this access to the union ministers actually mean. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And Josie would agree with me that all stories that he gets are not from these grandees at all. And apart from just having opportunities for selfies and other photo opportunities, they mean nothing. And I'm coming to a concept that the late Christopher Hitchinson brought up, scraping acquaintances with the great and the good. It's an expression that Christopher Hitchens had once used for the Great Britain and former Prime Minister who was a man of letters as well. He was a great orator, Benjamin Disraeli, who was a highly networked public figure of his time. There was another man in his time who, instead of scraping acquaintances with the great and the good, decided to pore over the archives of the British Museum Library, an out and out liberal who had no contacts or connections whatsoever with the high and mighty. Of course, we know that Christopher Hitchens, he became such a disgrace. He went back on his values and became an apologist for the American empire and its allies. But it's worth remembering what he said of the inveterate rebel in question and his prophecies in journalist work for which he had fallen back on statistics. I wish to quote Hitchens here. When journalists today are feeling good about themselves and sitting through the banquets at which they give each other prizes and awards, they sometimes like to flatter one another by describing the hasty dispatches as the first draft of history. Next time you hear that tone of self regard, you might want to pick up dispatches for the New York Tribune and read the only reporter whom it was ever actually true. So, this reporter was Karl Marx himself. Karl Marx was the Diego Maradona of journalism without the hand of God. Several notches above others with so-called connections and contacts, you can ask the same question about Julian Assange, the man of our times, who is incarcerated because he spoke truth to power, because he unearthed facts that are extremely inconvenient to the powers that be. So um, uh, he didn't have connections with the US president. He didn't do photo ops with the US president. He didn't have connections with the top officials of FBI. So these connections and access need to be redefined and looked at it in this age. And I feel that people like Josie Joseph has a greater uh, experience at handling people he thinks are important to him, and these guys don't come anywhere near there. And talking about the mediascape in the country, it's not fair at all not to dwell on fake news laws that are being consistently used to punish journalists. A lot of studies have gone into it, notably Germany-based think tank and organization called GIGA, whose extensive study of 6 countries, including India, is due to come out in February. Such studies, what is the importance of such studies? Such studies and the conclusions alone help us go beyond mere firefighting, because we do a lot of firefighting, and we should go beyond firefighting and look at building narratives to check the gross excesses and criminally repressive actions of the central government, which, in order to criminalize journalism, is doing its best, especially in the hinterland where journalism is far more dangerous because of the lack of proximity with cities. In cities where brutality tend to get amplified more. Offering journalists in rural areas, therefore, a helping hand must emerge as one of the new slogans in journalism among the journalist community, which will have to fight its battles from the front lines against the legal and digital repression of news gatherers. Finally, I want to bring your attention to the negatives and positives of artificial intelligence, with the segment making a record growth over the past decade. We are in an age of generative AI, and we also are talking about the prospects of artificial general intelligence. And when I started off in journalism in the late 1990s, I was told that if you don't know how to type, with all your fingers, I still type with 2 of my fingers, or maybe 3. Or if you don't know how to type with all your fingers, you cannot be in the business of journalism. I was also told, if you don't know shorthand, you cannot be in journalism for long. So technology, thankfully, has obliterated those tasks. In a similar fashion, technology is helping us focus more on creativity and less on what I like to call as white collar manual functions, like typing with all fingers and shorthand and checking spellings and grammar. It allows us to focus more on relevant aspects of journalism, which is to synthesize information and make sense of it than being mere bearers of message. And I wish to quote the great journalist John Pilger here, who said, I quote, "It's not enough for journalists to see themselves as mere messengers without understanding the hidden agendas of the message and the myths that surround it. Again, there are grave challenges. I was thinking that Noam Chomsky, the great public intellectual, had lost his marbles a few months ago when he said ChatGPT, brought out by OpenAI, is mostly about high-tech plagiarism. He said ChatGPT is high-tech plagiarism. I thought he was wrong. But as I read and try to understand more about it, I get a feeling that he could be right. AI generated content is simulation of existing content and involves copyright infringement of both text and image. We weren't interested in seeing the flip side in the euphoria that ChatGPT generated. Now there is a new concept emerging among writers and artists and researchers, and I think it's before it's late. Journalists also must get in, which is called fighting multimodal infringement. Let me explain it with an example. You have generative AI software for translation called DeepL. The moment you translate your work using that app, particular app, it's made in Germany. Whatever you have translated, as well as the original content, becomes public and loses copyright because you happen to use that app. We cannot align. The point here is we cannot align the clarity of purpose of these technology giants and their greed with our confusion and our kind of generosity. Chomsky is therefore right that generative AI is high-tech plagiarism in that it's it is simulation of content generated by rigor and endless hours of hard work by others. And among other work, they also encroach onto the intellectual turf of journalism. We need to be aware, cautious, and we need to resist it through conscious action. In a country where IP laws are lax, Indians are going to bear the brunt of it and lose out our work to smart men who will walk away with our products and make money out of it. And we want this has happened before. You might have heard of Viagra, and Viagra was made using public money. It was not made by Pfizer. It was only commercialized by Pfizer. And so was computer and the internet. The so-called smart enterprises like Pfizer and conmen like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates walked away with the fruits of taxpayers' money. And they lied to us that the private sector research and development made the world a better place. Public, it's not like that. No. Public investment in scientific institutions and defense and space units made cutting edge technology and products, and private enterprises made what they are hardwired to make, profit from other people's money, and in this case people who aren't even shareholders. I am stressing on this aspect, technology, because in journalism we have no practice of assessing how technologies affect the world and journalism itself, and we need to do that. We have technology correspondents who merely report what they are told by corporations, or the handouts or the press releases, stories about modern day slavery in the Congo to make electric vehicles, and smartphones and tablets are rare and often easily forgotten. In this age when technology is growing faster than ever before and often funded by public sector and banks where common people park their money, journalism cannot allow itself to be lazy the way it used to be. The speed with which technology grows will be faster than ever before. We also have to watch out for how technology is going to be misused in the short, mid, and long terms. One example of short term misuse is going to be how AI is going to be used in the coming elections in India as well as in the US and the UK. The rest of the world is writing about it, but we haven't started writing about it yet because I think we are too afraid even to crack a joke to par as mainstream media outlets. I wish to conclude by quoting an unlikely man, a smart actor of Hollywood, Denzel Washington, who has a knack for surprising us with the way he watches the world. Not long ago, he said, "We live in a world where if we don't read the newspapers, we are disinformed. And if we read, we are misinformed." It's time we work towards creating media platforms that will help people cut, cut through the dense fog of propaganda. Thank you.
Thank you, Ullekh, for very enlightening speech.